Today in studio we have Brian Whitmore of Radio Free Europe, who's also the creator of the Daily Vertical podcast. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So in the past couple weeks, we've seen a tremendous amount happening that affects this part of the world specifically and relations with Russia. Can you sort of talk about to what extent the attacks in Paris and the downing of the Russian jet by the Turkish Air Force will have an effect between relations with the West and Russia?
Well, I think we need to step back and ask ourselves what was Russia trying to accomplish with its intervention in Syria to begin with, right? You know, I've largely seen this as a transactional move. I mean, I think Russia was trying to create facts on the ground so they'd have a bargaining chip to use with the West and their international isolation and the sanctions, and at the end of the day, potentially get a free hand in the former Soviet space, in the first instance, of course, in Ukraine. And I don't think that was working. I think it was very clear to the West what Russia's game was. It was obvious they were not bombing Islamic State in Syria, but the anti-Assad opposition that was supported by the West, by Saudi Arabia, by Turkey, and by others. I think they were trying to prop up their ally, Assad. The Paris attacks changed the dynamic a little bit. The Paris attacks allowed Russia to say what it always wanted to say, we have this common enemy, it's terrorism, let's forget this Ukraine stuff, let's forget these sanctions, let's fight this common enemy together. Putin in his UN speech, he used the language of World War II to create this international coalition. Why does he want to repeat World War II? Well, because he wants to repeat Yalta, essentially. He wants to repeat Yalta and basically have the world divided up into spheres of influence. The Paris attacks gave him a window of opportunity to do that. We saw President Francois Hollande of France call for a broad international coalition. I think the downing of the Su-24 by Turkey also basically shows that this transactional move by Russia in Syria is not cost-free. In Syria, Russia is opposing the interests of a lot of people, not just the West, but Turkey, Saudi Arabia. Turkey had warned Russia again and again and again about violating its airspace, and again showed that they're not going to be shy about shooting down Russian aircraft, Russian military aircraft that strayed too close to Turkish airspace. So I think that these two things had opposite effects. The Paris effect the Paris attacks to an extent advanced what Russia was trying to accomplish in Syria. Although, to be honest, I think we underestimate the degree to which governments can compartmentalize their foreign policies. And by this I mean there doesn't necessarily have to be a linkage. Even if Putin got the international coalition he wanted to fight Islamic State, even if some deal were cut regarding Assad and his future, I think the West is able to, and the West has indicated that it's able to, compartmentalize the Ukraine issue. And remember that all the fears after the Iran agreement was signed, that the West had sold out Ukraine to get Russia to play ball on the Iran deal. Well, that wasn't the case at all. In fact, the West was able to continue its policy opposing what Russia's doing in Ukraine, while at the same time working with Russia to get an agreement with Iran. And I think history is going to repeat itself again. I don't think Putin's going to get his Yalta, so to speak. I don't think that's going to happen.
So what do you think at this point, what do you think he wants with Ukraine? What do you think he can get with Ukraine?
He wants Ukraine in Moscow's sphere of influence. I think it's pretty clear that Vladimir Putin does not look at Ukraine as an independent country. He famously said to former U.S. President George W. Bush at the 2008 NATO summit in Bucharest that this isn't a real country. Those were his words. And he sees this as Russia's legitimate sphere of influence. The way Putin looks at the world, and this is clear from his public statements as well as his actions, that the world consists of great powers, those great powers have spheres of influence, and that smaller countries within those spheres of influence are just little playthings for great powers. So what Putin wants here is a free hand. It's clear. The very idea of an independent Ukraine is offensive to him. So he wants to create a situation where this is his and he can do as he pleases here. But again, that's not going to happen. The world doesn't work like that anymore.
And with the recent, I mean, there's been a clear escalation in the fighting in Donbass. What do you attribute that to? Why is that happening at this point?
I think it's just a matter of keeping the pressure on. I mean, I think Putin's backed himself into a corner in Donbass. He didn't get what he wanted. I mean, I think plan A was to get all of what he calls Novorossiya, you know, that crescent-shaped strip from Kharkiv in the north to Odessa in the south. Well, one of the biggest surprises that came out of this for Mr. Putin, and even for to some extent to people like me, was the extent to which the Russophone in Ukraine is loyal to Kyiv. The Russophone in Ukraine showed itself, and it showed itself again and again and again in places like Kharkiv, Odessa, Dnipropetrovsk, Mariupol, that they prefer to be a linguistic and ethnic minority in a democratic Ukraine than be a linguistic and ethnic minority in an authoritarian kleptocracy. This showed me very clearly that this conflict was about values. It wasn't about ethnicity. And so Putin's backed himself into a corner in Donbass. He didn't get what he wanted.
Is the reform, like from a Western standpoint, is the reforms process seen as a success thus far, or?
Depends who you talk to. It depends who you talk to. I know there is a lot of frustration out there that reforms are going too slowly. This is true in the military sphere. This is true in terms of corruption and economics and so on. But again, I tend to see this glass as half full. I think you've got to give this place a break a little bit. I mean, you're trying to reform a dysfunctional economy in the middle of a war where you're being attacked by by a much more larger and much more powerful neighbor. But depending upon who you talk to, yeah, there's a lot of Ukraine fatigue in the West, but I think it's really important that the West not fall to that, because I happen to think what happens here is extremely important for the future of the post-Cold War international order on a lot of levels. What we have developing right now, it's not a Cold War. Mr. Putin would love it to be a Cold War, because that basically elevates him to the level of the West and to the United States. Russia is not. It doesn't have anything close to military or economic parity with the West. To combat NATO. There's no model that's an alternative to Western liberal democracy. Russia doesn't lead a bloc of nations. This isn't a Cold War. But what we do have emerging is two normative systems of governance. One to the West, which is based on the rule of law, based on democracy, based on the human rights and the sanctity of contracts and all of these things we all hold near and dear. And one to the East, based on patron-client relationships, corruption, the subordination of the individual to the state, and so the emergence of the merger of money and power. So you have these two normative systems competing with each other. And Ukraine, as does Georgia and as does Moldova, I would say pick three former Soviet states that find themselves in the middle of these two normative systems. And so in this sense, if this is, I mean, again, this isn't the Cold War, but we do have this emerging bipolar order right now. And if we look at it like that, the importance of Ukraine is equal to the importance of West Germany, if this were 1947. And for that reason, it's extremely important. And I've stressed this again and again and again. Every time I go to Washington or to Brussels and talk to policymakers, I stress this again and again and again, that getting Ukraine right now is as important as it was for the West to get West Germany right in 1947. And we should look at it that way. So I hope the West doesn't fall to this Ukraine fatigue. I mean, think about it. I mean, think about the benefits of getting Ukraine right now. I mean, first of all, it makes the Western system much stronger, bringing this very large, very important country into it. And quite frankly, as Professor Timothy Snyder at Yale said over and over and over again, European history doesn't really make much sense if it doesn't include Ukraine. That's number one. Number two, this would probably be the best thing that ever happened to the Ukrainian people, right? But number three, I think this, and perhaps most importantly, the effect this would have in Russia would be enormous. And
to see success in Ukraine.
To see success in Ukraine. And I don't just mean that this would be an existential threat to this regime, which it would be, but what it would cause, more importantly, in the population at large and in the elite, the catharsis that Russia needs. Russia's never gone through a catharsis in its 1,000-year history, where it's basically looked at itself and says, we cannot continue this way. I mean, we Americans go through catharses pretty much once a generation. I mean, I've seen one after the Vietnam War in my lifetime. We saw another one after the Iraq War. Yep. After each one of these crises, we come back stronger because we looked at our weaknesses, we looked at our mistakes, and said we must do better. I can't recall a time that Russia's done this in its 1,000-year history. In the shock of quote-unquote losing Ukraine, not that it's Russia's to lose, but that's the way people think there. The shock of losing Ukraine and to have a successful, democratic, prosperous Ukraine safely embedded in the West, the shock that would create might just lead to this catharsis, and that catharsis might lead to a Russia that is more willing to play by the rules of a rules-based international order. So I think what's going on here is not a sideshow. I think what's going on here is center stage, and it's one of the most important it's issue number one for me.